I just want to say that Zephyr and Zubin are like so brilliant. Normally, after giving these talk, doing this, I have a big headache. I don't have any headache. I feel sort of like this was cathartic.
One of the places where many of us encounter AI systems most immediately and where they most tangibly affect our lives is in the workplace. How AI systems are impacting workers remains one of the most pressing issues that policymakers must grapple with, and worker led organizing is playing a critical role in pointing the way forward.
For this Salon conversation, we've invited a panel of scholars and advocates to join us. Veena Dubal, Zephyr Teachout, and Zubin Soleimany discuss what they're seeing on the ground as workers grapple with the uses of artificial intelligence and push for change.
So I think of workplace technologies that are kind of emerging in four different categories. I think of hiring tech, so the kinds of predictive technologies that are making hiring decisions around who could even be in particular parts of the labor market. And then there's evaluative and predictive technologies, so technologies that are used to evaluate worker behavior, to predict future performance. These include kind of the things that you hear about in Amazon warehouses, like wearables, etc. There's an overlap with productivity tech, which I'm particularly concerned about, the kind of technology that's used to surveil and track workers. And then there's kind of like the brave new world of technology, the machine learning, the computer vision, the natural language processing, facial recognition technologies. And these are the things, for example, like ChatGPT, that's very relevant right now to the WGA strike. But also, I'm concerned about machine learning technologies that are setting wages based on data that the other kinds of technologies, like the productivity technology, is gathering, etc. And I would say the kinds of workplace technologies that we see have always been about increasing profits and decreasing worker control, and so it's always workers that are harmed, and always the capitalists that benefit. And I think um, you know we see some new arguments where capitalists are arguing that this is actually a way to these technologies actually are a way to solve for discrimination, to solve for having oppressive bosses, etc. But I think that those claims are really overstated, and that actually traditional forms of discrimination, um, traditional forms of oppression, that these things are actually getting amplified in ways that are difficult to see and track.
Yeah, I have some thoughts, but did you want to jump in on what you're seeing on the ground?
I think looking at both algorithmic management, but more, I think, towards the point of surveillance. I think how is this playing out? I think on the ground, in terms of the driver's experience and how they experience being at work, I think a big part of the answer is we don't really know, and I think we know that we don't know, because in the experimentation in the early years, looking at Uber and Lyft, we saw so many things that were happening that are no longer apparent. And just because they're no longer apparent, I don't think anybody thinks that means they're not happening anymore. One like pretty prominent example of this was back in 2015, 2016. Um, in New York, at least, what we saw was drivers would be getting these weekly reports in their app from Uber. And they would say, during that shift, you braked 52 times. 49% of those were acceptable. 3 of those were not. Keep working on those other 3. Or your acceleration was, you had over 50 instances of acceleration. 40 of them were sufficient. The other 10 were too fast. We didn't know anything about that standard, what was driving it, whether there's anything being taken into account, those instances of braking where that was, it wasn't the driver's fault. But so we introduced that when the Taxi Workers Alliance had a few members go to unemployment hearings and prove their employment status. We put that document into evidence, and then within a few weeks, drivers were not receiving those updates anymore. And is that black box still happening? I'm most likely sure it is, right? But that transparency has been lost, and I think what on that specific example, why Uber had been public about it was, I think there had been a period where they really wanted to be able to show off their technology, and that was there was a press release that said, "This is what we do. If you have a complaint about your driver's driving, we'll check this out. We can verify it. Can we deactivate drivers on this? You bet." So we know that's still there, but there isn't that look for drivers into how it's happening, when it's happening, how they could contest the truth of what that technology, what Uber wants that technology to assert, for example.
I think the black box point is really important, and it's a black box at a societal level, at an industry level, and at a worker level. And the obfuscation is part of the exercise of power itself. When I look at this moment, I see a few different things. One is that there's some workplaces that have always been totally surveilled. Home care workers, if not total, pretty close to total, even before this, or the capacities for close to total care. But there are really significant moments in the rise of surveillance and really significant changes in the nature of the technology. So the first big rise in electronic performance monitoring, as it was called, is in the late 80s, early 90s. So in 1987, you see about 6 million workers who have some form of electronic performance monitoring. That's kind of, the camera in the corner, making sure that the retail staff is not doing anything illegal while on the job. That's sort of the classic early adoption. Recording devices in call centers, also an area where we've seen a lot of early adoption of electronic performance monitoring. 7 years later, it's 20 million. So it's a really big and rapid shift. But still, those numbers are trivial compared to today. And then in the late teens to today, you see this, I'd say, a surveillance revolution in the workplace. And there's different ways to track it. One is looking at the industry itself that's selling to employers, that had a 50% increase during COVID, and is on track to continue to increase at exponential rates, according to most analysts. You look at individually reported stories. Because the black box, it's hard. Veena's done some really path-breaking work here. The Cornell has done some really important work looking at call centers again. But there's so many other workplaces. Amazon, we know a fair amount about. Even if we don't know the algorithm, we know they're using intense surveillance. So there's a mass shift in terms of the amount and the number of workplaces are covered. There's a sort of a radical shift in the intimacy with which one is being surveyed. And that is true at work first, and then I'll talk about the other changes. So wearable tech, which can then survey gestures. Amazon sort of famously is managing the movement of arms and the body, and a way in which the technology is surveillance and nudger, where they have patents out for more of this kind of tech. And then you also have a radical change in the scope of what is being surveyed outside the workplace. So given the American tradition of the lack of privacy within the workplace, it's always been true that employers can largely use information outside the workplace to make decisions, but they practically have had pretty significant limitations on doing that. And so even outside of the language of risk, real changes we see is the capacity to synthesize information means that there is a capacity to synthesize and use information outside of the workplace. And then finally, there's a changed ability to operationalize the information that is used. So one part of the surveillance workplace is what is being surveyed, and the other part is the way in which that surveillance translates into wage differential treatment, different bonuses.
If I could just add one thing, Sarah, I think that what is really different in this moment than like earlier moments of the application of technology to productivity, or the use of technology for surveillance, is, as Zephyr really beautifully laid out, is the scale and the granularity. And so I think that there are sort of moral norms around employment that we all over the course of the last century sort of coalesced around. And that is, although the employer has kind of the prerogative to do as they please within certain limits, that the rules of the workplace should generally be knowable, right? So even Taylor, the father of scientific management, in making the case for scientific management, which is what the kind of wearable technology that Zephyr is describing is an extreme form of, articulated that what was so revolutionary about this process was that he was creating rules that workers could know and that they could contest. And they could know whether they were doing a good job, a bad job. They could contest arbitrary decisions in the workplace. But when all of these rules become unknowable, the black box, and this speaks to Zubin's point about what we don't know about how workers are experiencing their work, it's very hard to know whether you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, um, especially when that analysis is being done, um, behind the facade of technology. So I think what's really changed, in addition to sort of the eradication of knowable rules and what that does to to worker experiences every day with regard to security and dignity, there's also the scope that Zephyr was talking about really lends itself to an environment in which not just individual conversations with the boss become difficult, but actually collective conversations become nearly impossible. How are you supposed to organize with your fellow workers a right that is protected by U.S. law when your literal every movement, your precise location, your conversations, both in and outside the workplace, are being tracked? This becomes really authoritarian environment. The applicability of political authoritarianism to the workplace, where people spend the most of their lives, such that they can't. It becomes even difficult to think about your own interests when everything is constantly being surveilled and documented.
I just think this is so important. I do think this is a revolutionary in the negative sense moment. That there are strains of this prior, but this is fundamentally changing the nature of the workplace. And we see the experiments playing out in gig work, but they are clearly coming to and exist in the employment context. So it is, although it is a unique problem for those who do not have the protections of being an employee, it is not. It's a uniquely difficult problem, but it is not unique to those who are gig workers or contract workers. It is very quickly becoming universal. When you look at the revolution, I think it is a little bit useful to look at the flip side, the retail side. So airlines were the real first movers in terms of individualized, personalized pricing. You basically knew what the prices were, and then they moved to a system of dynamic pricing. But until about 10 years ago, that was dynamic pricing changing based on supply and demand was a total outlier. Now on the retail side, 44% of retailers in a recent poll, and I think that undercounts because that's a percent of the total retailers and all the big ones do it, are using AI for pricing. So they're using a combination of dynamic pricing and personalized pricing based on their surveillance of the behavior of the person who's purchasing. So in 10 years, you see a move from a general understanding that you know what the price of ketchup is to general obscurity in the face of knowing how much a ketchup bottle is going to cost, how to budget for that. But at least as a consumer, even if I'm being spied upon, which there's all kinds of issues around that, My political beliefs, my conversations aren't threatening my livelihood. And so here you have a very unique combination of a revolution that looks like the revolution that happened in retail pricing, happening in worker pricing and worker compensation, plus the added threat that any decision that is made could impact your livelihood. So when you don't know what is being tracked, even that which is not tracked becomes a threat. And I think that's really important to understand the sort of psychological effect of this. I think people can understand this after COVID, that it may be that 90% goes nowhere, but the possibility that it could impact your pay, your ability to pay for your child's childcare, then affects your behavior with others, which affects organizing, which affects power dynamics.
So one thread that keeps coming up is the obscurity of this space. How much is unknowable? And I'd love to sort of unpack that a little bit and understand, the little that we do know, how have we been able to uncover some of these practices and where do we need regulators or policymakers to go further?
I think that we have only seen the tip of the iceberg through these kinds of examples that Zubin articulated. So, in the context of doing deep research with workers, finding out what they're sort of experiencing, but that again is really limited to a subset of workers that we have access to, right? So we only know what's happening in certain sectors, and that too, our knowledge is very limited because so much of it is hidden from us. So what we know is kind of limited to Uber drivers and Amazon workers because those are the workers who have gone to the media. Those are the workers who researchers are studying. For example, like we know very little about how people are experiencing keystroke software, what information is gleaned from that, how that transforms the day, etc. We know very little about what is happening with face surveillance software. So 2 times a day that Uber asks their drivers to verify their identity, and drivers will complain that they're unfairly terminated from their job due to faulty analysis of their face. Well, what happens to that face surveillance? We have no idea, and we can only I can sit here. I do this a lot. I sit here and I think, what could happen? Like, how could this be used? And that exercise feels so. I as a researcher feel so limited because I just do not know, and I cannot know. And so I think in terms of what regulators can really do in this space is put hard and fast guardrails around what's happening. We don't need to know everything to know that there are certain limits to what should be happening. And so if we can create laws and regulations to limit the scope of what employers can do in the workplace, I think that would go far in stopping things that we may not even know or understand about. For example, in California, Assemblymember Lorena Gonzalez sponsored a law that got passed that was primarily targeted at Amazon warehouses, and it didn't seek to regulate the technology. What it sought to regulate was the worker experience with regard to the technology. So workers had to know what their productivity criteria was, and they had to be able to sort of have a conversation with their employer about that criteria. That all had to be reportable to the state, and they couldn't be asked to do anything that would ultimately interfere with their health, with their bodily functions. And so it was a really good, I think, model example of how regulations can be passed without going through the process of having to know, because we'll never know.
There's a few other areas that we do know, but this question of knowing, I think, is really important. It's going to come up a lot. So we know because we see what companies how companies sell themselves to employers. So you have companies that sell themselves as being able to track tone of voice, and mood. You have companies that sell themselves as taking a picture every 5 seconds or whatever, 2 or 5 minutes to be able to check in on employees. Companies that sell themselves as tracking keystrokes. And like Sarah, when you ask the question, this is the question. For those of us in this area, Veena's done this great work talking to workers, but outside of journalistic work, it's really hard. I've spent a fair amount of time on trucking Reddits, looking at Reddit, at truckers' own experience of having their brainwaves managed for weariness. A lot of this new technology is introduced in the name of safety. That's true in warehouses. That's true in driving. I think you're going to see that true across the board, and you see it in a lot of the public statements. Cameras that track truckers while they drive, and call centers. And I think there's been, that's another area where, in part because of the nature of the work, it's been easier to figure out what is going on. To sort of underline what Veena is saying, I think there's sometimes an instinct, a very understandable instinct, which I share, for a certain kind of transparency. Which is, show us the algorithm that produced the result. I'm happy we're having this conversation because I'm really interested in other people's thoughts on this. But I think that when you're talking about AI, that transparency is that form of transparency. Show us the algorithm becomes somewhat ludicrous. It's not that there is somebody who understands the algorithm. It is not understandable. So the idea of having a technical procedure that we could then see and understand whether it was fair or not fair, because this worker was productive and that worker wasn't productive in the Taylor model, that just doesn't apply when you're dealing with large language models in the same way, and synthetic information, let alone dynamic decision-making that is informed by behavior. So although I think it would be very, very useful to know that, and don't take anything that I'm saying as trying to stand in the way, the kind of transparency, which is still important, that I think Veena is talking about, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, is knowing, okay, so what's everybody getting paid? What are their hours? The transparency. What are the technologies that are being used? The transparency into what is actually happening to workers, and then the regulation flowing from that, as opposed to show me the algorithm transparency.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that that's absolutely right. Workers have such limited resources, so few laws on their side, that to date, a lot of the work to elucidate the logic behind algorithmic management has been focused on transparency, because that's how data privacy laws are written. So there's a really amazing organization in Europe called Worker Info Exchange that was founded by this brilliant Uber driver, advocate, activist, James Farrar, and his colleague Yassine Islam, who were also the plaintiffs in a landmark case in the UK, finding that they were workers who deserved basic protections. James started this amazing organization, and what he's basically been doing is suing under GDPR to get information on what data is being collected on workers. But what he really focuses in on is explainability. He says, I don't care what the algorithms really look like. We just need to know what the rules are. And I would go one step further to say that at some point, we don't need to know what the rules and the algorithms are. We just need to get rid of those rules. Warehousing has happened for a really long time without first-based surveillance technology, without wearable technology, without terminating people through software. These things are not intrinsic to the work. There are ways to increase productivity that are humane, where workers are not treated like they are part of a machine. And so I like Zephyr, am really trying to push this conversation to maybe a more radical place. Like, we've moved so far in the direction of dystopia, that I think that the law and regulation needs to be much more robust than focused on even transparency and explainability. It needs to be focused on creating safe working environments in a broad sense. Like, safety is not just like, I'm not going to break my arm and I can pee regularly and not get a UTI because of the productivity quotas. It's also that I can spend the 10 hours that I spend at work with a sense of dignity, without feeling anxious, without having my emotional state be constantly one of uncertainty. And I continue to think that we cannot say we live in a democratic society when people spend all of their time at work under rules that are so authoritarian. It's not just that the rules are authoritarian, but that the rules are authoritarian and completely unknown. It's such a dystopic place.
One thing that really brought this to light for drivers recently was, and I think Uber's been trying this out in a lot of places, but announced recently that, partly in line with having complaints become verifiable as something that could protect drivers and riders, was that they would be beginning in car recording through the app if somebody reported a safety incident. Interesting feature of this was that if the driver requested it for their own safety, the rider would be notified, which raises all sorts of questions of sort of like, what is that, an invitation to sort of clean up their act or whatever, if that happens. But if the rider requests it, the driver would not be notified, which for drivers just raises the question of like, well, if I'm not being notified in this instance, am I ever, is this happening all the time without me being notified? To go to that question, like all of this stuff that has been happening and what could regulations do to change, to not just to change transparency, but to change behavior, and sort of like how high tech does that solution have to be? The pay regulations and transparency rules that we have in New York City are far from perfect, and they could go much further. But I think a couple of examples show just like how much just sort of like even that basic introduction into pay transparency has produced for drivers, which is, before those rules went into effect, everybody knew that they were being nickel and dimed on so many trips, whether intentionally or not. They would say, I drove to Fort Lee, New Jersey. I know that trip is 10 miles long. I saw it say 10 miles at the end of the trip. And then they would receive payment and the records would say 8 miles. And it would be impossible to prove it unless you took a screenshot of every trip. And some people did. I met a driver who went to an arbitration and presented these things and presented Google Map printouts and lost, and then was fired because of things he said at arbitration. And just the impossibility of it was so highlighted by that guy's one story. Then TLC passed the rules and people were still getting underpaid. And then there was just, even with that minor external check of recording miles, minutes, the companies were made to then supplement payments where they fell short for whatever. And people saw that. People saw that immediate shift of what just even the most sort of minimal oversight could do. And I think for the longest time, pay transparency in terms of what drivers were taking home as a percentage of the trip, that was obscured by upfront pricing, where it had been a static percentage of every trip. But like through publicly available data now, drivers are able to track those trends and say, that despite what Uber might be telling the public, is they have been charging drivers more while not paying drivers more the last 2 years. Like that is quantifiable and identifiable now in New York City. And just knowing that, with that sort of relatively low tech regulatory intervention, gives drivers so much more power to organize and be able to respond to an employer entity that otherwise would hide all of that information and its implications from them.
And what Zubin didn't mention about this also is that New York City is the only city, only area in the entire country where drivers in this sector have a pay floor. So in every other area, this is a workforce where some workers make less than others, frequently falling below the minimum wage. Some people make nothing per hour. Some people lose money to work while they're working. But because of the robust organizing that the New York Taxi Workers Alliance has been doing in New York City since the early 90s, I believe, establishing themselves as a force backed by the collective power of drivers, both Uber drivers and taxi drivers, they have achieved what no one else has been able to achieve. So in addition to the pay transparency, just the ability to go to work and say, I know that at the very least, I'm going to make $18 an hour. And that is something that we cannot take for granted.
What's interesting in reading your work, Veena, just about the drivers in California and talking about their, the variation of payment they receive in their experience. We've definitely seen the same thing. In the old days, it used to be when there was all the venture capital money was subsidizing new drivers, right? So that they would earn $1,500 a week. They'd get all the trips so that the payouts wouldn't have to be made through that money, is what it seemed like people were seeing. In reading your paper, and talking to drivers these days, you still hear those same sorts of things, but not to the same degree. And I think just with the pay standards in effect, there's so much less wiggle room to manipulate drivers to that algorithmic wage discrimination, even if it still happens, right? And it is just being a floor. I think it really sets a baseline for what can be done and how much money is left to do that, right?
Zephyr and I have both been really concerned recently with the advent of personalized prices for workers, or what I've called algorithmic wage discrimination. So the use of data extracted from labor, fed into machine learning systems or AI systems to pay workers variably per hour, so that you and I could be working in the exact same place at the exact same time in the exact same way with the same skill and seniority and make very different amounts. And this sort of flies in the face of traditional idea and legal ideas of work, right? Equal pay for equal work, the feminist cry from the early part of the 20th century that was enshrined into law. It flies into the face of our sort of even conservative ideas of meritocracy, that the better you do your work, the more you will be paid. The more senior you are, the better you will be paid. And it creates a system of workers who are really atomized, even when they're not atomized, but really atomized in how they are remunerated. And so what Zubin, I think, is articulating is that because in New York City, folks have a wage floor by law, it is much harder to create just wage discrimination between drivers in a dramatic way. Versus in California, especially we've seen since the passage of Prop 22, since drivers' wages have dropped significantly, new drivers continue to articulate what Zubin is saying, that they'll make a lot of money at the beginning as a way to draw them in, to keep them in. The longer you do something, the harder it is to leave. And so those drivers are saying that they're earning a lot per hour. Drivers who are more senior have been doing it for many years. Their wages have dropped precipitously. But I think more to the point, they are making amounts that are unpredictable. Again, even sometimes people think that they figured something out. They start in a particular point, drive towards the airport. They can sort of predict over a period of time that they're going to get at least within a range of earnings in a specific amount of time. And then overnight, whatever they've figured out has shifted because the system has shifted. And so this kind of wage setting through digital technologies is something that we are seeing experimented or has been experimented on in the on-demand economy. But Zephyr has done this amazing sort of taxonomy of how we see this spreading to other sectors, because this is sort of a brave new world, supposedly independent contracting, no laws are sort of no worker laws are being applied in this space. It's a site of so much experimentation. And as these things get normalized, they then spread to other sectors. So I would love to hear sort of Zephyr talk a little bit more about the other places where this is happening and how it's affecting people.
I do think it's important to understand that a combination of labor power and societal expectations around what constituted a fair wage created a general expectation that, at least in larger employment contexts, people would be paid the same wage for the same work. And as Veena said, that was true even within Taylorism, right? Even within a model of sort of radical efficiency. And then there are these exceptions, few exceptions around labor organizing and exceptions around protected categories. But in law, outside of the protections provided by the power of labor, there were not exceptions. And this new technology is driving a hole through that and leading to, we don't know how much yet, but we can anticipate that it's only going to grow, wage discrimination across the board. And so I see it in 5 different ways. One is the kind of extreme Taylorism that you see in the Amazon warehouse model, which has very significant health risks, and I don't think we should take lightly. But I think it's important to recognize it is not all the forms of wage discrimination. So I pick up 5 fewer packages, I get paid less. That would be one basis of differential wages. A second is behavioral wages, which I think is probably the most insidious. So I'm in debt, Veena's not, therefore I might need the job more. That is not particularly complicated data to scrape right now. And basically have AI system make a judgment that it's going to be worth less for me. It's going to cost less for me to stay on the job than it's going to cost to keep being on the job. And so that's just one example of a kind of behavioral. So I get 5 cents less an hour than Veena because I come with debt. And again, nobody may actually see the debt analysis. They just may see the recommendation that my minimum working wage is a 5 cent less than per hour than Veena's minimum working wage. And by the way, just like targeted ads, they're probably wrong all the time. There's nothing like magical about it. And then there's experimentation, which of course has always happened in the workplace. And you'll hear a lot of this when you talk about this. This has always happened. It's always happened, but not at this scale and not in a way that leads to the rational paranoia that I think comes along with this. So I'm going to experiment on 30 workers and 100 to see how low I can bring my wage or how many hours I can push or what kind of tasks work. But I may have signed a contract where I agreed to such experimentation. The fourth is dynamic pricing, which is supply and demand based. And I probably should have put that higher up because it then, unlike the worker being at a job which largely has the kind of wage, the wage floor that Zubin is talking about, there isn't a floor. It's dependent on, or the floor is minimum wage if you are in an employment relationship. And it's dependent on supply and demand, so that all of these are examples of the company taking the surplus. They're basically exploiting informational asymmetries to take the surplus, right? And then the final one is games. And I mentioned this, there was some reporting that Amazon had hired some of the same folks or were using games like, I forget what they're called, like Rat Racer, the techniques that are used at the One-Armed Bandit. And it makes sense that you would use, and also there's reporting from drivers of stimulation like this, using pay, different forms of pay to stimulate behavior, basically using what we know about gaming, psychology and gambling and addiction and our own psychological weaknesses to, dopamine feedback systems, using our own internal self-regulating drugs against us, basically. And what is hard about it is that what we would anticipate if I were a rational profit maximizing employer with capacity, that you would use all 5. And the worker wouldn't know which one or where or how. So that it's important, I think, both to separate them out and to recognize that the experience is not going to be one of control over, oh, today I'm getting gamed, and today I'm getting treated differently because I have a longer commute than my coworker, or because my politics are different. And so that all of those can combine to, again, as I call it, a state of rational paranoia, which is, as Veena says, really dangerous for democracy. It's dangerous for the power dynamics of the workplace, for organizing, but also for what it does to us if we want people to live and speak freely about those areas in which they care and have expertise, to collectively learn instead of having all the learning go to privatized spaces.
Yeah. And I think we really have to think about what is happening outside the firm and what's happening inside and in between firms. So I am also particularly concerned about how these payment mechanisms, all the data and data analytics that come out of the technologies that are extracting the data and using it to control and surveil and manage, what happens when that person leaves the job? So that data is very profitable, right? Like this is employment data that large employers are going to be able to and want to purchase in sort of large data sets. And then how is that data then used on the person in their next job? So traditionally, we have this sense that when you go to your next job, you are in a position to share some information and to not share other information, right? So they can ask you certain questions about how much you were paid in the previous job, and you can choose not to answer. You could choose to answer honestly. You could choose to answer dishonestly, but you have something that you can withhold, which ends up being for particularly for middle wage workers, kind of like their only bargaining tool in relationship to their employer. But if an employer can purchase everything that is known about you from a previous workplace, no matter that information may be flawed, might be wrong, even if it's not variable compensation, they can set your compensation in ways that are really unfair and that you have very little control over. So, for example, there are a couple of instances where I've been thinking about this. In Japan, IBM is using Watson compensation software. Maybe they're using it elsewhere also. Because IBM workers are unionized in Japan, we happen to know that they have introduced this software and that they are using it to analyze worker behavior, using it to analyze previous compensation, what they call trends and insights and tools, all these sort of all this HR language to set variable wages. And so as a result of my new paper, someone reached out and they were like, hey, this is happening to like software engineers, actually in this context, people who we traditionally think of as having more power. I also happen to know that this is happening in the healthcare sector, not just with porters, but also with nurses, fundamentally interfering with how nurses not just how they get paid and evaluated for their work, but also how much power they have in the workplace to make individual decisions around care, and that ultimately having an impact on their pay. And so, like, I think we've sort of focused primarily again in these places where we know this is happening. We can kind of see it. We can talk about it. Gig economy is like 80% people of color, depending on where you're sitting in the U.S. Amazon workforces are also majority people. Amazon low wage workforces are also people of color, immigrant workforce populations, people who have very little power. And I think that some people have a sense, some people, maybe even some regulators and lawmakers even have a sense, well, that's just going to happen there. That work is always going to be bad, and there's very little that we can do about it. And for those folks, I would offer that is horrible way of understanding how a human life. But in addition, like, this is not going to stay in these low wage racialized sectors. This has already gone into other places that we traditionally think of as professional and as maybe more white and white collar.
I mean, it's such a It's a great example of why simple rules need to apply. The ability to say have a wage ban. By ban, I mean a band. Like, oh, so this is how much Sarah made last time, which, as a sellable data point, is that trying to protect against it in complicated ways seems like, I don't want to say it's a fool's errand, but I think you need these simple rules, because otherwise there are other ways in which you can approximate that data, as we've seen with all, personally identifiable data, that if you try to only narrow the sale of one thing, you can find other ways to approximate it and lead to the same forms of discrimination and exploitation.
So, I mean, we're discussing all of this in the midst of an ongoing strike that's specifically targeting, a negotiation, among other things, a negotiation around the contractual provisions relating to the use of AI in the workplace. And I know each of you has been engaged with different groups of worker organizers around these issues, and I'd be curious to talk about one, what you see as the fronts that workers are engaging the most on around this, and then two, a related question, but we're also in the midst of a groundswell of attention around needing to regulate AI and regulate algorithmic decision making systems. And I'm curious if we can talk a little bit about, in what ways is regulating AI in the context of the workplace really distinct? Is what we need AI policy or other kinds of policy measures or other kinds of accountability measures, given the power inequalities, the information asymmetries that are specific to working conditions?
I saw a really great quote. It was from a WGA striker, and they were asked, what are you striking about? And they said, well, have you seen what's happened to the music industry and the journalist industry over the last decade? And the person said, yeah. And they said, that's what we're striking about. And so I think it's important to note that it's not just about the AI, but how the AI relates to workplace conditions, how it relates to wages, how it relates to the production and sustenance of good jobs, how it relates to workforce dignity. There was a kind of hysterical article that came out, written by two Oxford economists who predicted that all of these jobs were going to be displaced and replaced by technology. And it started this really hysterical conversation about, oh, well, what are we going to do with all these workers who don't have jobs because there are robots who've taken over their jobs? And it's really kind of a silly conversation. It's not about the displacement of workers. It is about the conditions under which people labor. And so in my own work, although in 2008 was the first time I heard a taxi driver tell me that he was so worried that self-driving cars were going to completely eradicate his job. We know now that this is self-driving cars are probably never going to be possible, in the sense that these futurists have sort of projected them to be possible. Like, they're never really going to completely replace driving, as a profession. But what they have done is created a narrative about how these workers are going to be replaced and displaced regulatory concerns about technology. So the concerns are about maintaining the jobs. They're not about maintaining good jobs. And so in the ride-hail context, I don't hear workers talking about concerns about being displaced anymore. They're concerned about the three things that workers have always been concerned. They're concerned about their wages, they're concerned about their workplace working conditions, and then they're concerned about termination. And all of these things are being fundamentally shaped through technological interventions in the workplace. And the irony is that all of this is being done in the name of freedom. That somehow if you don't have a boss, a physical boss, if the man isn't in the room with you, then somehow you're free. And what longtime drivers will tell you, people who have done this over the course of many, many years and not just a few months, is that those feelings of freedom are actually quite illusory, because the boss is actually just being replaced by engineers, social psychologists, and executives who are working together to reshape the experience of oppression and subjugation through an app.
Right. I think, for us in New York, our next big campaign is unfair deactivations, and trying to apply a just cause standard to ride-hail drivers. The immediate problem that runs up against is when you're looking at the standard that, for example, would be used in the NLRB. If looking at an organizing workers termination was pretextual or not, you would have some basis to compare it to. And that inquiry cannot begin without that transparency around whether the activities were taken, what were the consequences, and laying bare what those standards are. So that for us is going to be a crucial part of that campaign. But I also think goes to the point that Veena and Zephyr have been talking about, is like perhaps it's not so much the algorithm that needs to be regulated itself, but the outcome, and then perhaps the rest can follow.
I really recommend Karen Levy's book on truckers if you're interested in this data-driven, because it's a great example of what sociologists and lawyers are looking at threats of autonomous drivers and what actually ends up happening, right? So what ends up happening is what she follows and interviews drivers and sees what happens as the federal government mandates a safety mechanism which has a monitoring feature. And so what ends up happening is the safety mechanism actually leads to increased stress, unhappiness, higher turnover rate, which in turn actually decreases safety on the road. So the thing that is ostensibly about safety is not about safety. Autonomous driving is not the issue, but the nature of the workplace is transformed. So two things can be simultaneously true. One is that AI is totally transformative, and the other is that, as Veena so beautifully put it, there's a persistent way in which AI discourse has avoided looking at the terms of employment instead of these sort of catastrophic, apocalyptic, the apocalypse is upon us, and therefore we can't be concerned about the real conditions of people's lives. And I think it's incredibly important to ask how, because as Karen points out, the sort of after 10 years, the reality of workers' lives is they're integrated with technology that is playing a monitoring, spying, surveilling role. It's not clear even from her book the degree to which it's affecting wages, because there's this black box element, right? Like there's still a lot we don't know. What we've seen over the last 20 years is that when AI changes the workplace, it doesn't remove it. And then also there is a through line, and I am not, I support the strike, but it is not an industry I know particularly well. But I would say there is a very clear through line with AI and what we're talking about and the strike, which is concentration of power. When power is centralized, data amplifies that power. And so even old models of balance, and there's no golden age here, but times when labor had more power, we need to rethink how a modern version of that same power structure actually gives employers more power because of the information asymmetry of the moment and because of greater concentration within these industries. So both concentration and information concentrate. Maybe that's a simpler way to put it. And it is incredibly important as we're thinking about AI not to allow for basically 3 synthetic or 7 synthetic agents that have apps then built on top of them, sitting as the centers of power that are deciding people's wages. So I think anti-monopoly plays a really critical role here. And part of what Veena's talking about in terms of the transit of data from one employer to another, that I think of as a fundamental power problem. You want workers to be able to leave freely to a new job, and also not be still somewhat controlled by their last job.
If I could just underscore one thing that I think is so important that Zephyr is saying with regard to the anti-monopoly conversation in the larger labor market. Just to underscore that not everyone has not all employers have the money to buy this kind of data extracting software, the kind of AI software, the kind of learning software that do all the dystopian things that we've been talking about. It is large employers who have a lot of market power, with the effect of squeezing out the little guys. And so there is a really important conversation that Zephyr has been just leading beautifully to be had here, not just about workers' rights in the individual and collective sense, but also the rights of small business owners who cannot compete when the larger firms are using these kinds of anti-competitive mechanisms to operate in ways that are not traditionally anti-competitive, but really do have the effect of further concentrating their power.
I just think that one of the things that Veena has been doing that is so important is talking to drivers and putting it in a form that can be shared more broadly. I think there is so much journalism to be done here. So that when we talk about the kind of transparency that's needed, and the markup has been doing some great work on this. I mean, there's good journalism, but there's a lot of room for a lot more, because once this is framed in human terms, I think it's so easy to get it framed in it's complicated and priestly and algorithmic.
So a driver out here who recently filed a claim. Uber offered her $2,000, and she calculated how much she thought that she was owed, and she said, "I'm owed $13,000." From the before Prop 22 was passed within the statute of limitations, and they were like, "Okay, here, like if you are savvy enough to."
Right.
Push for it under a certain amount, it's actually not worth their paying their lawyers to arbitrate.
Right.
It's not worth their time.
Thank you, guys. Great to see you.
Gotta go.
Bye.
Take
Thank you so much.